Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. I've been asked to give a talk about dependent origination, so that's what I'm gonna do. This is a very central teaching of the Buddha, and a lot depends on it. It's very central to understanding of karma and rebirth, for understanding results of actions, for understanding the nature of our situation in samsaric existence. It was formulated by the Buddha for one reason, to provide an alternative to refute the false views of the philosophers that depended either on creation by a deity or a random chance arising. These are two philosophical positions that were prevalent in ancient India, and in different form, different guise, they're still very prevalent today. The Buddha's teaching he called a middle path between these two extreme views. And in the world, these two views are always at loggerheads. The modern version would be a creationists versus atheist evolutionists. It must be the modern version of this. They seem like they're totally polar opposites, always at enmity with each other. But from the Buddhist position, they both share one feature that, from the Buddhist perspective, causes them to fall into philosophical error, in that both of the extreme views depend on some degree of randomness or arbitrariness. In the creationist view, as a deity, Ishvara, Brahma, Muhammad, Allah, or Jehovah, whoever, there's a God, a deity that's beyond cause and effect, is the origin of all things, the first cause. And then if you're examining any philosophical question, you can only go so far until you run up against the last resort is always, well, that's the way God made it. And you can't question the will of God or explain it. So causality, or cause and condition, only runs so far in such a system. From the point of view of the materialist atheist position, of which there were schools in ancient India, and of course this another prevalent school of thought today, the arbitrariness comes in falling back in the end on random chance or random arising. This is illustrated by, if we take the case of a human being who's born with certain characteristics. Some people are born smarter, some are less smart, some are more beautiful, some are less beautiful. Some might have birth defects, some might be born with extraordinary gifts. Now, there's this whole range of possibilities. In the creationist view, you have to say God made them that way. And that's an unsatisfying answer for a case if, a baby's born with spina bifida or something. You to say God did it this is a very difficult theological problem for creationists. They call it the problem of theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? And there's really no answer to it. And the materialist view, they can explain, or they try to explain, the how. They can study genetics and all these kind of physical causes, but to say why was I born this way? They can't answer. It's not even considered a meaningful question. To the individuals affected, of course, it's the most significant question, but they can't even attempt to answer it. There's a randomness, a random factor has to be put into a purely physical system. There always has to be some chance. Or you could say this mutation arose because a cosmic ray hit the fourth chromosome in your father's sperm, and that can explain like the physical how, but it doesn't explain why. Why did that have to happen? And they say, well, it just did. It's just random chance, which to the Buddhist is not good enough. The Buddha taught this dependent arising, paticca samuppada. And there's different degrees or different formulations of it, but the simplest one is a simple statement of causality that the Buddha said, because this arises, that arises, because this ceases, that ceases. And that's the entirety of the simple formulation of the general dependent origination. And it seems like a simplistic, like a truism, but it's staking out a strong philosophical position among the schools of India, saying, there is cause and condition, and the whole Buddhist philosophy is based on this idea that things arise according to causes, in the conditioned realm. Conditioned by causes, things arise, and not otherwise. So everything has a cause. In fact, everything has multiple causes. It's a very complex web of interdependency. There's no place in the Buddhist philosophical system for any chance or luck or randomness. So, having staked out that position, then the specific dependent origination is the teaching that expounds on that principle in the case of a sentient being, in particular a human being, to say, how does this existence come to be? What are the causes and conditions? What is the process? How can we explain the process of human manifestation? And this is done by a linking of 12 chains, the 12 links in a chain, the 12 nidanas of the dependent origination, explaining how one thing leads to another. And it's an explication that covers the past and the future, the past, present, and future, and some of the nidanas are considered causal and some are considered resultant. And it's been taught by the Buddha with some variations of different kind of specific applications, and it's been endlessly discussed and commented on in succeeding centuries. It's a very central teaching. It's a model of how things occur. So as a model, to some degree, it's a simplification, because it's, as I said, it's one of the principles that nothing arises from a single cause. So you shouldn't take it too linearly. We're talking about the principal causes that lead from one stage to another and cause the full feature of a human existence. And it's cyclical. It repeats again and again, and it occurs on different time scales. The most obvious explication of the 12 nidanas covers past lives, the present, and future lives. So it's like a macrocosmic view, but it can also apply in terms of mind moments as going on all the time, immediately as we go through our lifetime, We're constantly, every moment, running through a small version of the dependent origination. And as I said, it's cyclical, so there's no real beginning point. And this is another thing that's become generally accepted in Buddhist thought, is that the universe or samsara is without a beginning. However far back in time you go, there was always a yesterday. This is a point to note, is this is not something specifically that was said by the Buddha. He refused to speculate on ultimate origins. He said it's not worth concerning yourself with. You can't find the answer by thinking about it. But it's become accepted by later Buddhist philosophers as a general principle, and the beginninglessness of samsara is quite in tune with everything else that the Buddha taught. The system makes sense if we assume it's beginningless. So without a real beginning, for the purpose of explanation, there has to be taken an arbitrary beginning, and is generally taken at the point of ignorance as the first nidana. This is avijja, not knowing. And this is one case where the Pali is very accurately translated by the English as ignorance. Ignorance is English word is from the Greek not knowing, ignosis, and the Pali is avijja, not knowing, or both cases not knowledge, actually, not having knowledge. So avijja in this context refers specifically to not fully comprehending the nature of reality. And it's only an arahant is beyond ignorance. Only an arahant has truly understood the nature of conditioned and unconditioned. Prior to that, we're all in some degree of ignorance all the time. We're operating without full understanding. So it's like blundering around in the dark. And in iconography, you have seen, we have a few of them around here. I don't think, no, there isn't one in this room, but we have around in our river, we have a few different versions of the Wheel of Life. It's like a image with all little circular icons. This is something that was developed in Tibetan Buddhism as a teaching tool, so they could teach illiterate people with images. Someone would explain it, and then they could remember. And one of the circles represents the 12 nidanas, and the first one, avijja, is represented by a blind man walking along with a stick. So this is avijja. We're operating in this world, in this universe, with incomplete knowledge. And of course, in a matter of degrees, you can be very ignorant, or you can be less ignorant. But we're all ignorant to some degree until the point of arahantship. And because of ignorance, we do stuff. This is sankhara. This is the second stage. And this represents a particular subset. Sankharas in general means any formation. But in this case, it represents a particular subset, volitional formations, acts done with volition, which is the point at which karma is made. This is the karmic making moment. And this is caused by ignorance. Because we don't know what we're doing, we're blundering around in the dark, we end up knocking things off the table, right? Like we disturb the universe. We do stuff with incomplete knowledge. So every action we do with body, speech, or mind, it creates a disturbance in the fabric of the universe. And this is a karma. This is we're doing karma means literally action or work. We're disturbing that balance of the universe. If we look at the physical laws of the universe as we know them, there tends to be a lot of tendency for things to balance. That's Newton's law. For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. And then there's all these sets of conservation laws: conservation of momentum, conservation of angular momentum, conservation of energy. And what these boil down to is if you create a disturbance in a closed system, then some other part of the system will react to compensate. So there's a strong tendency for the universe to try to zero itself, right? You push it one way, it'll pull the other way, and it'll tend over time to zero itself. And this is how I see the best analogy for karma, is that you're creating a ripple, a disturbance in the universe, and then you receive the results of that as a balancing factor. It's an important detail that the Arahant makes no karma. The Arahant, because he is not acting from ignorance, so his actions create no disturbance in the universe. Now, because of actions done out of ignorance in the past, then this causes consciousness to arise in a new existence. This is the third stage, vijnana, and this is given as patisandhi vijnana, or rebirth linking consciousness. It's because of actions done out of ignorance, there's a disturbance in consciousness arises out of that into the new existence. When a rebirth occurs, a new life continuum, it's because the being previously had died, ceased its biological functioning, without having attained arahantship. Then that means the last mind moment at death still had an impulse of desire and still had an impulse of old karma remaining. And this cause has to have a condition. Then it has to have a result. And the result is moment of consciousness arises somewhere else, causally linked to it. This is a process of rebirth. It's sometimes asked, what is it that is reborn? And the answer is nothing at all. It's merely a linked process of cause and effect. One moment causes another. The difficulty lies because we falsely assume there's some substance continuing in this life, from moment to moment, whereas there's many consciousness moments arising by cause and effect, causally linked in a sequence. And that sequence is not extinguished at death, because there's still that impulse, there's still a desire, and there's still karma. So this causes a mind moment to arise elsewhere in a suitable condition. So one who has made suitable conditions for a human rebirth will be reborn as a human. One who has made conditions to be reborn as a deva will do that, and so on. And so a new continuum begins. This is consciousness arising afresh in a new situation. Then consciousness having arisen, there then unfolds name and form, namarupa, which is mind and body, or the psychophysical organism. So in the case of a human existence, and similar also in most of the animal kingdom, what occurs at the moment of conception is the coming together of three elements: the father's sperm, the mother's egg, and the consciousness seeking rebirth. These are the gandhabba, as it's called, as the first moment of consciousness. So there's a combination of factors. So you see in children, they take after the mother and the father. They have genetic inheritance from their parents, and then they have cultural conditioning by their parents as they're raised, and more or less skillfully they learn things from their parents and from society. But we also see that they have, many cases, unique personalities and quirks and traits of their own that don't seem to come from anywhere. Huh? This is a third factor that's not from mother, not from father, but from their previous karma. And this is required for the unfolding of the new entity. This is something that I find very intriguing, is this whole question of the unfolding of a new entity. I've mentioned him in talks before. There's a kind of maverick biologist named Rupert Sheldrake who's written books on the problem, as he puts it, of morphogenesis, like how does form arise in a new entity. And his career began as an embryologist, studying how embryos form. And he came to the conclusion that it's not adequately or fully explained entirely by the genetic code. That's certainly a major part of it, but the blueprint in the genetic code is basically just a cookbook for proteins. And the first thing that happens when a string of proteins peels off the RNA and goes to incorporate into the cell, the first thing it does is it folds itself into a three-dimensional shape. And almost always it folds correctly. If it doesn't, you've got some kind of dysfunction, you've got a cancer or something starting. But somehow it folds itself into a complex three-dimensional shape, and no one has ever explained how it does this. When there's thousands of ways it could fold wrong, it always folds right. It always comes into the right shape. And he then goes on to say that, Rupert Sheldrake, he goes on to say that cells in an embryo, the cells are then, as the embryo develops, they're differentiated. You have liver cells and skin cells and brain cells, and they form organs of correct shape and placement and interconnections. And none of this is adequately explained, how this happens. It's extremely complex. And he said there has to be some other factor involved. And his explanation, he postulates what he calls morphogenetic fields, which is where the conventional scientists, they can't compute this. It doesn't. They don't accept this because it's a non-physical, pure information field. So it sounds like very much like the Buddhist idea of mind as an abstract. Well, it's pure information, not locatable in space. This is another aspect of the morphogenetic field. It's not locatable in space. And it connects all the beings of a certain grouping that are connected, and there's hierarchically organized. So there's one morphogenetic field for each individual, then one for all your close family. They all share characteristics. They're all tuned into the morphogenetic field. Then one for everybody of the same race and species, and then like all vertebrates and so on. Like, there's a hierarchical levels of these fields that control the formation of beings. So it's not exactly like the Buddhist system, but it's close, and he points out the problem of explaining things on a purely physical basis. It doesn't work. It's incomplete. It's not wrong. Obviously genetics is correct, but it's not complete. So the Buddhist position is that mind is the factor, that the unfolding embryo is in like this information field that forms correctly according to the field of the mind. So this also has a bearing on the mind-body problem, that conventional materialist science would say that mind is a product of the brain. That Buddhism really turns it on its head and says you need a mind to develop a brain. That to have physical structures at all, you need to have mind. Form is based on information. Right? It's a purely mental factor. Matter is the stuff. Right? There's a difference between matter and form. Matter is just stuff, but then form is when it's arranged in more or less complex patterns. And that means there's information. So that means there's mind. So we have the dependent origination, ignorance, actions, karmic actions, then consciousness, then name and form. So this so far explains like the genesis, the arising of a being in a particular shape. Then the next stage given is the six sense bases, which the fully formed being now born out of the womb and walking around in the world has six senses, the five physical senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, and the mind sense, mental sense that sense mental objects. And the image of this is a house with six windows. This is how we get information through the six senses. And this is the only way we get information. So it's a limiting factor involved as well, in that our picture of the world, and this plays into the ignorance, our picture of the world is incomplete because it's based on the limitation of our senses. We cannot see ultraviolet light. Some bees and insects can see ultraviolet light, so they see a whole color additional to what we can see. Obviously, dogs and other animals can hear high-pitched sounds higher than human ears can hear. So there's all kinds of stuff going on out in the world that our senses just don't know, just don't pick up. You know? And sometimes it could be lethal. If the room fills up with a poisonous, odorless gas, you would be dead before you knew it. So your senses don't detect, your sense of smell doesn't detect the gas. So our senses are just a limited window by which we perceive the world. But perceive it in that way we do, and this leads to the next factor, which is contact. And contact is when you have an actual experience of sense impression. And that necessitates three factors coming together. You have to have a viable sense organ, an active sense organ. You have to have consciousness, and there has to be an object. So if we take the case of the sense of sight, and let's say you're looking at an apple, if the room is pitch dark, then you don't see the apple because the eye doesn't work in darkness. It's not viable. Or if the eyes are shut, even, you know, or if there's a dysfunction in the eye, you don't see the apple. If you're asleep or unconscious, you don't see the apple because consciousness is not arising through the eye. And obviously, if there's no apple there, you won't see the apple. So you have to have the three things operating simultaneously: the physical organ of sense, consciousness, and the object. Now, the next stage that arises is our reaction to the sense impression, which is Vedana or feeling. Having made a sense impression, the mind processes it in various ways. Perception kicks in and determines this particular configuration of red, circular red shape is an apple. Thought formation may kick in and you start thinking, well, I like apples. That looks like a nice Macintosh apple. I remember when I had that apple back last week. That was really good. You know, this is the process of thinking, thought formation. But the key in terms of the dependent origination, a very inescapable, immediate reaction is the reaction of Vedana, feeling. This is the mind reacting to a sense object as being either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And this is immediate and not volitional. It's like an automatic response. It's our response to experience. And there's some subtleties to it, some nuances. Only the two, according to Abhidhamma explanation, only the two senses of touch and mind sense are immediate enough to directly cause feeling reaction. So if you step on a hot coal with your bare feet, you feel painful sensation right away. You don't have to think about it. You know, it's painful sensation. Everything else has to be mediated through the mind, which means perception and so on occurs first, and then the mind has a feeling about it as being pleasant or unpleasant. If you'd never seen an apple before, didn't know what it was, you might not have any reaction to it. It's just an odd red thing. But if you like apples and think they're delicious, you see an apple, you have a pleasant feeling. So the resultant feeling is something that occurs continually as we experience sense objects and parse them with the mind. We have this reaction. Now these last few stages, all the way from consciousness down through name and form, six senses, contact, and feeling, these are all classed as resultant, meaning they just happen. They're based on past karma. They're based on that stage of karmic formations running down. So the karmic formations is the last causal factor that is active, and then after that everything's resultant. It's like the hand of cards you've been dealt. They're just playing out. And all the way down to feeling, we have no control over that. It's just what happens. Though it's based on our past actions, we don't control it in the present. Then, because of feeling, craving arises in the mind, tanha. This is the first set of new active or causal stages. We're now into a new section of the new creative section of the loop. We're coming into being. Craving is defined as the tanha, as the desire in the mind for sense experience, a pleasant sense experience, and desire to be and the desire not to be. And this is rooted in feeling. If we examine any of our cravings, and we all have lots of different cravings, specific cravings, but if you examine any one of them, why do I crave this thing or this experience, and you trace it back to the root, you'll see it's because you think that you're going to get pleasant or happy feeling out of it, or you're going to escape unhappy feeling. So feeling is the root of craving. And when feeling arises in the mind, this can lead to the craving. Like if it's pleasant, you want more of it. If it's unpleasant, you want to escape from it. And it's at this moment, this is the key link in terms of practice. You can't do anything about your feelings. They're just given. So you feel pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. But then how you react to them is critical. If you indulge in them and validate them and want to chase them, then you're giving into craving. And you start a new cycle of dependent origination from that point. You're coming into being and creating more suffering in the future. So a lot of the meditation teachers talk about this, that the critical moment is noticing being mindful of your feelings, being mindful of your reaction to things, and not to be upset about that. You know, that's just how it is. You're going to have a feeling. You're going to feel either pleasure or pain or neutral. But how do you react to that is the question. And if you give into craving, then you start this whole cycle going on again, which we do constantly in the course of the day, again and again, with sense objects arising or mental objects. We follow the path of craving. You end up fueling the next round of the dependent origination. And it becomes harder and harder to break after that initial point. It's still very subtle and weak at the first initial arising, and that's the point at which it can be broken. If it's missed, then you've missed an opportunity, and it keeps getting stronger and stronger. It becomes uncontainable, you know, at some point. So after craving arises upadana, which is translated as clinging, although a more literal translation would be fuel. It's the stage where craving matures into a project. Like craving is a very simple, rudimentary movement of mind. Just like I want, I don't want, and it's just very, very simple, very primitive. But then it becomes clinging. You're beginning to set up a project of acquiring the object, so that you're setting up in the mind a relationship of self and other. For there to be a possessed object, there must be a possessor. So this is when the self begins to be created. It's a necessary mental structure to hold this relationship of possessed and possessor. Self is created. And with the creation of a self is the stage of becoming. You come into fully realized as a self entity. You know, self has been created. And because it's an illusory conditioned form, it's unstable and it falls apart. So this leads to the final stages of birth, sickness, old age, and death, which represents the future. You know, you're setting up in the future. And this occurs in the stage of multiple lifetimes as we're, you know, feeding through our cravings and clingings and becomings. We're creating karmic conditions for a future birth. And whatever is born ages and dies. It's inescapable. And death is a great ignorance. And so all the accumulated learning and memories of the lifetime are lost, and you begin again. So this is a dependent origination in a nutshell. Is because of karmic actions we come into being, and then we operate in the world, and we make more karma, and we keep feeding this cycle again and again. And this is how we come into existence. This is how we exist as human beings. It's entirely an explanation of limited to the realm of first and second noble truth. It's talking about an explication of samsara. This is how it is. You know, this is conditioned existence. And it has the phases of the past, present, and future, and causal and resultant. And understanding how this operates is understanding first and second noble truth in detail. And the objective is to break the cycle, to escape from the dependent arising and realize nibbana, and not continually go around and around the wheel and come into existence again and again. It's related to the idea of samsara, from the verb samsarati, to go around or cycle around. And dependent origination is, you know, best thought of as a cyclical process that we're endlessly repeating.